What if I told you that 1,000 years ago, men crossed the most dangerous ocean on Earth without maps, without magnets, and without ever knowing their exact position, and still arrived precisely where they intended to go? For centuries, the North Atlantic erased certainty itself, swallowing ships without warning, dissolving coastlines into fog, and turning skilled sailors into lost men whose names never reached shore. And yet the Vikings returned. They sailed west when Europe still feared the edge of the known world. They entered waters modern captains respect even with satellites overhead. And they did so guided by something that still resists clean explanation. Not a compass that obediently pointed north, not a chart that promised safety, but a way of seeing the world that treated uncertainty not as a threat, but as usable information, something to be read rather than defeated. Tonight, we are not asking how the Vikings navigated without maps. We are asking why their way of navigating still unsettles modern science and quietly challenges how we understand knowledge itself. To understand the Viking compass, we must first erase something modern minds depend on instinctively: the belief that direction is fixed and absolute. North, south, east, and west feel natural to us, almost comforting. But for early medieval sailors, they were fragile ideas that dissolved the moment land slipped below the horizon. The Viking world was not measured in degrees or coordinates, because numbers offered little help once the sea began to move beneath you. Instead, their world was measured in time, in light that shifted across the deck, in wind that changed texture and sound, in temperature that crept through wool and skin, and in memory carried from one voyage to the next. A journey was not defined by a point on a map, but by how the sea behaved beneath the hull, by how the sky aged through the hours of a single day, and by how the sun rose differently as seasons quietly reshaped the world. Navigation was not a tool you carried in your hand. It was a skill you lived inside, learned through patience, attention, and trust in patterns that only reveal themselves to those willing to listen. In Icelandic sagas written generations after the Viking Age, a strange object appears quietly, almost in passing, described without ceremony or explanation, as if its purpose were already understood. A sunstone, lifted toward the sky when clouds swallowed the sun, allowing its hidden position to be sensed through subtle patterns of polarized light that the human eye can learn to recognize. For a long time, historians treated these passages as metaphor, assuming they belonged to poetry rather than practice, symbols of belief rather than tools of survival. Then archaeology began to whisper a different story. Crystals capable of polarizing light do exist naturally in Scandinavia, and controlled experiments now show that under heavy cloud, fog, or twilight, they can still reveal the sun's position with surprising reliability. No compass needle spins, no arrow points north. Instead, the sky itself becomes a readable surface, transformed into a quiet instrument, but only for those who know how to look and how to trust what they see. Among the most debated artifacts ever linked to Viking navigation is a small and unassuming wooden disc recovered in Greenland, its surface marked with shallow lines, whose meaning scholars still argue over today. To modern eyes, it looks too simple, too crude, to belong to a culture capable of crossing an ocean. Yet some researchers believe it functioned as a sun compass, not by pointing north, but by measuring the length and direction of a shadow at specific latitudes and seasons. Critics insist the device is far too imprecise to guide a ship across open water, assuming that successful navigation requires exact calculation and constant correction. Supporters respond that precision was never the goal. The Viking compass was not designed to tell sailors exactly where they were, but to help them remain within a survivable corridor of error, a narrow band where landfall was still possible and disaster could be avoided. It is a concept modern navigation quietly abandoned once technology began promising certainty, and in doing so, taught us to expect control where earlier sailors learned to accept limits. Viking navigation was inseparable from oral tradition because knowledge that could not be spoken could not survive. Routes were not memorized as distances or directions, but as sequences of lived experience, carried in stories repeated until they became instinct. After 3 days, the water grows colder and heavier against the hull, a signal that the ship has crossed into a different current. After 5 days, birds appear that circle but never land, creatures that tell you land exists somewhere beyond sight. After 7 days, the smell of earth reaches the deck before any coastline breaks the horizon, carried on wind that knows the way before the eye does. These were not superstitions or sailors' tales. They were accumulated data, refined across generations, who understood that survival depended on remembering subtle patterns others ignored, and on trusting memory as a living instrument shaped by time, attention, and loss. Modern navigation treats deviation as failure, something to be corrected immediately, erased as quickly as possible. Viking navigation treated deviation as inevitable because the sea itself was never still and certainty was never promised. Their ships were built to forgive error, able to land on unfamiliar shores, slide onto beaches, or retreat just as easily as they arrived. Their crews carried adaptable tools rather than fixed plans, and their decisions assumed uncertainty from the very beginning. If fog erased the sun, they slowed their pace and waited for information to return. If currents shifted beneath the keel, they adjusted gradually, reading the change rather than fighting it with force. The Viking compass was never meant to eliminate risk, because risk could not be removed from the ocean. It existed to manage risk, to keep sailors within a range where survival remained possible and where patience mattered more than control. To the Vikings, the North Atlantic was never an empty space separating destinations, because nothing about it behaved like emptiness. It was understood as a living system, shaped by moods, cycles, and signals that revealed themselves only to those who paid attention long enough. The color of the sea shifted with depth and temperature, offering quiet clues about what lay beneath the hull. Long rolling swells carried information from storms hundreds of miles away, arriving before the wind itself, warning those who knew how to read them. Birds traced invisible coastlines long before land rose into view, their flight patterns sketching geography across the sky. Even whales became navigational references, not as omens, but because they followed routes shaped by the same underwater landscapes that guided ships. Navigation, in this world, was ecological rather than mechanical, a practice rooted in relationship rather than control, and in listening rather than command. There is a quiet discomfort in accepting that people without modern science solved problems we still struggle to explain in clean, mechanical terms. We are taught to trust tools over perception, numbers over intuition, devices over memory. Because machines promise certainty where human senses feel fragile, the Viking compass unsettles that belief, because it suggests that understanding does not always need to be written down or engineered into metal and glass. It proposes that knowledge can live inside the body, carried through habit, attention, and long familiarity with the world. It also suggests something more challenging, that survival may depend less on control and precision, and more on restraint, patience, and knowing when not to act. This idea runs against the modern instinct to dominate uncertainty rather than coexist with it. And perhaps that is why the Viking compass feels uncomfortable, because it reminds us that progress does not always mean improvement, and that some forms of intelligence were quietly left behind. When magnetic compasses and detailed charts entered the world of navigation, something subtle and easily overlooked began to fade. Sailors no longer needed to read the sky with the same care or notice how light shifted through cloud and mist as the day unfolded. They stopped listening as closely to the sea, to the language of swells, currents, and temperature that once carried meaning across long distances. Navigation slowly became something imposed on the world, a process of correction and command, rather than a conversation with forces already in motion. The Viking compass did not disappear because it failed to work. It faded because it demanded too much from human attention and perception, in an age increasingly eager to hand awareness over to instruments that promised certainty, even as they quietly narrowed the way we understood the world. The greatest secret of Viking navigation is not an object, or a crystal, or a disc of wood. It is the acceptance that the world cannot be fully controlled, only carefully read, and that survival belongs not to those who conquer uncertainty, but to those who move gently within it. As this film ends, perhaps take a moment to reflect on the journeys that shaped your own family, the migrations, the labor, the adaptations that carried people across oceans, borders, and generations. If this story stirred a memory, or a question, or a connection to your own history, you are invited to share it below, because history survives not in artifacts alone, but in living remembrance. If this documentary mattered to you, simple acts like liking, subscribing, or commenting become quiet ways of preserving the past. Because the truest compass humanity ever had was never magnetic. It was memory, carried forward, one generation at a time.